Now we're coming to a conversation with Mozilla. When you think about Mozilla, you think about Mozilla Firefox, but that's not all. They are on a mission to do the same for AI, what Mozilla has done for the internet. And that's going to be the topic of our next fireside chat, building a global public AI ecosystem. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator, who is the editor-at-large at TechCrunch, Mike Butcher, in conversation with Mark Surman, the president of Mozilla. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Flo.
Thank you very much, everyone. Mike Butcher here, technology journalist based in London, and you can say hi on social media, at Mike Butcher. I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Surman, who's president of Mozilla. And I think that the way that we're going to frame this conversation is that we've all heard of the rise of generative AI since late 2022. We've all heard about the platforms being built, Perplexity, Anthropic, OpenAI. But there is an alternative universe which became much more publicly available to us as a public conversation with the rise of open source AI, most typically identified by the launch of DeepSeek in China. But that's not the, and obviously, of course, Llama from Meta. But that's not the end of the story by any means, because really we're very much at the beginning of this whole revolution. And so with that framing, I think it's really interesting to delve into this subject, because it's not really talked about nearly enough. We're talking about the idea of having public infrastructure AI, which is really for the good of society, I think. And we'll also be touching on things like digital sovereignty, and clearly it has geopolitical implications. But if I can turn to you, Mark, initially, like obviously, as the introduction said, Mozilla Foundation has a long history of championing open source. It's an open source browser, and it's been working in that space for a long time. But should we get some sort of definitions down first?
Sure.
So, open source, what would you consider to be open source AI infrastructure in a public sense?
There's a lot of words inside there, so we'll go
I know.
one
Well,
by one.
we're here to unpack.
So, I mean, I think as everybody probably knows here, the overall idea of open source is that it's a common digital good, like Wikipedia or Linux or Firefox. And that means that anybody can contribute to it, make it better, and anybody can also use it freely. And it doesn't mean it's not commercial. One of the things that is interesting is the Linux ecosystem is really mostly paid for by AWS, Microsoft, Google, all the people who build on top of it. Is really just that they pool resources so that the underlying infrastructure is, is something they can rely on and is lower cost to them. And so if we take that forward to AI, we can imagine the same thing. And we see hints of it in things like DeepSeek and Llama. Maybe we'll get back to those.
Yeah.
But the idea is, what if, like Linux replaced Sun, replaced Windows NT, you ended up having open source LLMs, other aspects of the open source, of the AI ecosystem being open source. Those could be things that everybody could contribute to if they need digital infrastructure in small dollars, and then pull back out freely. And I'll just lay kind of one thing back in there. And actually, I guess I would say, when I say people, I mean companies, I mean governments, I mean research labs, everybody who's investing in this stuff, if they all invested to some degree in common digital goods, it would be a lower investment and a higher return. And there's a great paper out of Harvard looking at the past era of open source and the economics of it. And the figures are kind of astounding. They look at the sort of Web 2.0 era and the Linux era, and their estimates are that represents, in aggregate, $4 billion of supply-side value. So like people put $4 billion of effort into building what we all use as open source, and $8 trillion of demand-side value. So that $4 billion produced for everybody who uses Linux. If I'm a researcher, if I'm a government, if I'm Amazon, if I'm Microsoft, $8 trillion of value. So what if we actually took all that government money, startup money, and put some of it into open source AI? Think of the return.
It would, I guess, presumably, it would take a relatively small amount of money to actually make quite a large amount of difference.
Yeah.
But one of the things is that we can't really it's quite hard, especially in this space, to divorce the idea of open source LLMs, which you can even run on your laptop or even your phone at this point.
Increasingly, yeah.
And compute, access to compute. And really, this is the big blocker, perhaps, because in order to run open source AI at scale, you still need access to compute, and that costs money, and sure, you can buy it in, but this is the, don't you think that this is the advantage that the platform-based AIs, like OpenAI and others, have over open source?
So let me kind of put it in a historical analogy and then kind of get to your specific question. It feels like when we see compute as the blocker, two things. We're conflating the compute we need to build, things like large language models. There'll be other architectures, training them, and using them, inference. And so I'll pull those apart in a second. But I think in kind of seeing it as a big blocker, we're kind of like looking at computing from the late 60s or 1970s and saying, you know what? If people want to get into this computing thing, the only way to do it is to have enough money to buy an IBM mainframe. And the game just changed in 1981, and it wasn't just IBM that benefited. In fact, it wasn't IBM that primarily benefited from the introduction of the personal computer. They opened up a whole ecosystem where compute was cheaper, like unimaginably cheaper. And I think that's going to happen. There are incentives in the market for that kind of innovation to happen. But then let's get real about right now, because is that going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? I don't know. But I think that the amount of compute, the amount of electricity, we will solve that problem at some point in the
so
coming
you
period.
think that, well, I mean, and compute is also related to energy,
Yeah.
and that's a whole other.
I think
mean,
both
we
of
could
those
get
things
into
we're going to
fusion
solve.
and God knows.
We have not just the climate motivations, which we have, but just the economic motivations to lower the cost of compute and to lower the energy consumption are incredible incentives for innovation in that space. So I think you just have every reason, even just from a market perspective, to believe we will crack that nut. But let me go to the open source compute piece, which is, one is the use of open source models, using Llama on your laptop or on your own server or a European cloud. One thing is that there is also an incentive for the cost of inference to go down and the cost of inference to be distributed. So one of the companies we invest in through Mozilla Ventures is a company in Hamburg, which is called Flower AI. And they basically do distributed inference where they're putting small models on your laptop, eventually on your phone. A lot of that cost gets offloaded as much as possible onto the local device. And so that makes open source models much more viable. So you're going to see innovations that drive down the cost of inference. And then on the training side, one of the things that I pitch, this is when I really mean public AI, is that governments should require whatever's funded, research universities, startups, even bigger companies, in terms of giving out government compute grants. Europe's talking about $2 billion in gigafactories. Where I'm from in Canada, there's billions of dollars going into compute. Have a rider on those contracts that what you train on public infrastructure is open source. There's no reason not to do that. Public money should mean public goods.
I see, right. So you're laying out the way that this could play out in infrastructure terms. But let's talk about sort of the European side of things. We're here in Berlin. There's obviously been a conversation about how does Europe compete in the new generative AI era against the behemoths platforms coming out of the US that have access to enormous amounts of resources. Where do you think that sits in a sort of a geopolitical sense? Are we going to see the rise of European sovereign AI and sovereign compute? And how does the open source conversation play into that?
So we're already seeing people calling for that, even in government policy here in Germany, looking at there being open source as a path to sovereign AI, because it's something that's transparent, it's something governments can develop collaboratively. And then I've met with people here at GITEX who have what they're calling the Eurostack movement, the idea that for sovereignty there should be a sovereign tech stack and a sovereign AI stack. My argument is that the two things really go together, open source and sovereign AI. and that just looking at Europe actually will get Europe into trouble. I think you want all democratic and open economies, Canada, Japan, European countries who are leaders in this, the Nordics, to be pooling into open source AI in a way that we have basically a third stack, a stack that is not big tech and a stack that is not China. And I think open source is the path to that third stack and is the stack to Europe and having digital sovereignty.
But I think it's hard to imagine a world where we would decouple from sort of US technology, either computing or infrastructure.
I didn't say US, I said big tech.
Big tech, big tech, sure.
So I think in the end, if you think about the difference between Steve Ballmer and Satya Mishra, Microsoft realized that open source had to be a part of its business strategy. I think that is what is going to happen. And if Europe or Canada or Japan wants to have globally competitive tech companies, betting on that is the way to bet.
What can you point to that's maybe sort of real-world examples of what you're talking about playing out right now? What's Mozilla doing? What are some of its initiatives? How is it interfacing with European governments or, shall we say, non-China governments right now? Are there any examples out there where you think, right, these guys are going in the right direction?
Well, I'll give you 3 examples. One, we've set up a separate company called Mozilla AI, which is focused on open source AI adoption. It's not actually, much like Linux in the 90s, that there isn't the technology. The technology is emerging. It's hard for developers to use. And so Mozilla AI is basically focused on increasing developer adoption of open source AI. So that's a concrete thing that we're doing. Then you have companies like Flower, there's another one, Umi, I would say Mozilla Ventures, which has got about 50 companies in it. About 10 or 15 of them are sort of open source or responsible. Actually, if I include responsible, probably more like 20, 25 of them are focused on that. So we're seeing a startup ecosystem emerge around this, which is a good sign. Like, people think they can monetize open source AI, and these are really values-driven founders.
Right.
And then the last thing I'll just say on governments is, you do see a move towards a call, especially since the kind of trade war started, sovereign tech. But I really urge governments to think about sovereign tech with each other and not in isolation.
Right. I have one more question, and I know that we're out of time, unfortunately, but our session was cut short. But I'll just ask for a very short answer, which is, if the EU gave you €1 billion, what would you do with it?
Oh, 1 billion euros is not very much money.
Right.
But what I would do is I would convince them to take all the money that they have already committed, 200 billion, and make sure that it drives open source.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Mark, from Mozilla Foundation. And from me, Mike Butcher. See you later.
Thanks, everybody.
Huge round of applause. Mike and Mark, thank you so much. A great conversation. Always wonderful to have you on stage.